The first thing Avery Caldwell learned about Ravencrest Castle was that some rooms did not wait for winter to become cold. She told herself the trembling in her fingers came from the draft slipping through the northern corridor, from the stone walls sweating beneath a moonless sky, from the iron key lying in her palm, like something taken from a grave, and not a guest chamber. It was easier to blame the cold than admit what everyone in the Great Hall had already made clear without saying plainly. She had not been welcomed into this castle, only placed somewhere no one important would have to look at her. The servant who led her upstairs was a narrow-shouldered woman with kind eyes and a mouth trained not to use them. She carried one candle between them, and its small flame bent backward each time they passed an arched window, though none of the windows seemed open. Avery followed with one hand on the banister, and the other closed around the key, feeling its teeth press half-moons into her skin. Below, the dinner voices had already risen again, polished and warm and comfortable, as if the brief matter of where to put the unwanted omega had been handled and could now be forgotten over wine, roasted apples, and the soft clink of silver forks. Ravencrest was larger than any place Avery had ever slept in, all black stone and old oak and corridors that turned when they should have ended. The air smelled of beeswax, pine smoke, wet wool, and something older underneath it, something buried so deep in the castle that it seemed less like a smell than a memory. At the end of the northern hall, the servant stopped before a low door banded with dark metal. There were other rooms along the corridor, doors with brass handles and warm light showing beneath them, but this one sat apart, tucked under the slope of the tower roof, as if the castle itself had tried to hide it from sight. The servant lifted the candle. For 1 second, Avery saw her expression change, not enough to be called fear, not enough to be reported, only a tightening around the eyes. "This is the room they assigned you, Miss Caldwell," she said softly. "Not Lady Avery. Not guest. Not protected ward of North Hollow. Just Miss Caldwell, spoken with the careful pity people used when kindness could get them punished." Avery nodded, because nodding was safer than asking why the lock was crusted with frost on the inside of the castle, why the floorboards beneath the door were darker than the others, why the servant stepped back before Avery even raised the key. "Thank you," Avery said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. The woman hesitated, then pressed the candle into Avery's hand as if it were contraband. "Keep it burning if you can." Before Avery could answer, the servant had already turned away, her steps quick, but not quite running, swallowed by the curve of the corridor and the waiting dark. Avery stood alone before the door for 3 long breaths. Somewhere far below, laughter rose from the great hall, Vanessa Cole's bright and easy among it, Ethan Vale's lower and familiar enough to hurt before Avery could stop it. She placed the key into the lock. It resisted, then turned with a sound that traveled through the wood and into her bones. The room opened on a pocket of air so cold it seemed to have been sealed there for years. Her candle guttered. The chamber was small, no more than 12 feet across, with a narrow bed, a cracked washbasin, a dead fireplace, and one tall window filmed white around the edges. A rug lay in the center of the floor, faded almost colorless, its corners curled like dried leaves. Avery stepped inside and the door eased shut behind her without being touched. She did not gasp. She did not cry. She set her small bag on the bed, straightened the sleeve of her plain blue dress, and lifted the candle higher. That was when she heard it. Not a knock. Not the settling of old wood. A slow sound beneath the floor, soft and deliberate, as if something sleeping under the boards had heard her name without anyone speaking it. Avery did not move when the sound came again. She only lowered the candle a few inches and watched the pale light slide across the faded rug, across the warped floorboards, across the thin seam where dust had gathered in a line too straight to be accidental. Her wolf had been quiet for so long that Avery had learned to live around the silence, the way a person learns to walk around a locked room in her own house. But now something inside her chest stirred, not strong enough to be called a voice, not gentle enough to ignore. 3 days earlier, she would have told herself she was imagining it. 3 days earlier, she was still standing in Ethan Vale's library with her hands folded in front of her, listening to people decide what she was worth. The memory came back with the smell of polished walnut and old paper, sharper than the cold room around her. She had gone to the library because Ethan had sent for her, and because some foolish part of her had still believed sent for meant wanted. He had stood near the window in his dark dinner coat, handsome in the careful, practiced way that made strangers trust him too quickly. Beside him stood Vanessa Cole, wrapped in cream wool and pearls, her pale hair pinned like she had never once had to do it herself. Elder Grant Mercer sat behind the desk with a ledger open before him, tapping one finger against a page as if Avery were not a person, but a sum that refused to balance. The arrangement was never formalized, Mercer had said. There is no claim to dissolve. Ethan had not looked at Avery then. That had been the first honest thing he had done all afternoon. Avery understands, he said. She had understood nothing except the strange emptiness spreading through her hands. Vanessa tilted her head with a softness that did not reach her eyes. It is kinder this way. A young woman without a strong wolf should not be pushed into a role she cannot carry. Without a strong wolf. The phrase had landed quietly, which somehow made it worse. Avery had been called delicate before, dependent, agreeable, useful in small rooms and unnecessary in large ones. But this was different. This was her future being removed with clean gloves and polite voices. Mercer turned a page. North Hollow can offer temporary protection until she is placed elsewhere. Ravencrest Castle has space. Not prime space, naturally, with the visiting council arriving. Naturally, Vanessa repeated, almost smiling. Ethan finally looked at Avery, and for 1 second she searched his face. For the boy who had once walked beside her through an apple orchard and promised that rank did not matter to him. She found only a man relieved that someone older had said the difficult part for him. Avery waited for tears, because everyone else seemed to expect them. None came. She smoothed the cuff of her blue dress, the one she had mended twice at the wrist, and asked the only question her voice could hold. When do I leave? Mercer blinked. Vanessa's smile thinned. Ethan looked away again. That was how Avery learned that dignity could feel less like pride and more like a small, hard stone held under the tongue. Now, standing in the tower room with the candle trembling over the floor, she understood something she had not understood in the library. They had not sent her to Ravencrest because there was space. They had sent her because there was a room no one else wanted, and because they believed a quiet Omega would accept any corner if it came with a locked door, and the word protection placed over it like a sheet over broken furniture. Beneath her feet, the floor gave one slow, answering creak. Avery knelt, not because she was brave, but because she was tired of being arranged by people who spoke of her as if she were not in the room. The rug did not want to move. Its edge had hardened against the floor with years of dust and cold, and when Avery worked her fingers beneath it, a grey line lifted into the candlelight, like the castle exhaling something it had been holding too long. She paused, not from fear exactly, but because the small stubborn sound of fabric coming loose reminded her of the way the great hall had gone quiet earlier that evening when Elder Mercer had asked where she was to be placed. It had not been a grand humiliation. That would have been easier to name. No one had raised a voice. No one had pointed. No one had said unwanted, burden, mistake. They had done something cleaner than that. They had made her disappearance sound like household management. The dinner had been served under chandeliers made from black iron and antler, with candles burning above tables long enough to seat every council family in North Hollow. Avery had sat near the lower end, between a visiting accountant who never introduced himself, and a widow from a neighboring pack, who looked through her as if Avery were an empty chair. Across the hall, Vanessa Cole had been placed beside Ethan, where everyone could see the careful ease between them. Vanessa wore silver at her throat, not a crown, not yet, but close enough to make the women near her glance twice. Ethan laughed at something she said, a low, private laugh Avery remembered from orchard paths and summer rain, and the kind of promises young men made before ambition taught them better manners. Avery had looked down at her plate and counted 3 roasted carrots, 2 slices of dark bread, and 1 sprig of rosemary she had no appetite for. Then Vanessa's voice rose, light and polished. "Where will Miss Caldwell be staying tonight? I hope someone remembered she is not used to northern drafts." The words sounded kind. The room heard what sat beneath them. Mercer dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, and smiled as though the matter had only just occurred to him. "The south rooms are occupied, and the east wing is reserved for ranking guests. There is a chamber in the north tower that will suit temporary needs." The widow beside Avery went very still. The accountant stopped moving his fork. Even the servants along the wall seemed to find the floor suddenly interesting. Avery felt the change before she understood it, the way animals feel a storm before clouds arrive. Ethan looked at Mercer, then at Vanessa, then finally at Avery. His expression carried apology without inconvenience, sympathy without risk. He said nothing. That was the part she would remember. Not Vanessa's small smile. Not Mercer's neat cruelty. Ethan's silence, placed carefully on the table between the bread and wine. A servant brought the key on a small tray. It was iron, long and old, with a black ribbon tied through the end. When Avery picked it up, cold bit into her palm so sharply that her fingers nearly opened again, but she closed them instead. Somewhere near the center of the hall, a man she had not allowed herself to look at fully turned his head. Logan Hawthorne had arrived late, after the first course. And the room had altered around him the moment he entered. People lowered their voices before he passed them. Chairs shifted back to make space he had not asked for. He wore no crown, only a charcoal coat and a dark clasp at his shoulder, but authority moved with him as plainly as firelight. His eyes settled on the key in Avery's hand, and for one breath, something crossed his face too quickly to read. Recognition, perhaps. Or warning. Then Mercer began speaking again, and the moment folded itself away. Now, in the tower room, Avery pulled the rug back another inch and found the first mark, cut into the floorboards beneath it. A crescent curve, so worn it should have meant nothing. Her quiet wolf lifted its head inside her chest. Avery kept one hand pressed against the marked floorboard and waited for the feeling inside her chest to become something she could name. It did not. Her wolf had never spoken to her in the clear, confident way other girls described when they came of age and learned the shape of the creature living beneath their skin. Avery had grown up with a quieter thing, a presence that watched from far away, more candle than flame, more memory than instinct. Yet now that distant presence had lifted its head, and the room seemed to notice. The candle flame pulled low and blew. The window gave a soft click as frost tightened along the frame. The crescent mark beneath her fingers was cold, but not dead cold. It held the strange chill of river stones under moonlight, something old enough to be patient. Avery drew her hand back slowly. Whatever waited under the floor had waited longer than one night. She had not. Her toes had gone numb inside her worn shoes, and the fireplace across the room sat black and empty, its ash so old it had settled into a grey crust. She rose because wonder would not keep her warm, and because people like Vanessa Cole and Grant Mercer had always mistaken quietness for surrender. Avery had learned, long before Ravencrest, that survival was usually made of small unglamorous things. She dragged the thin curtains together until they overlapped, then used 2 hairpins to fasten them against the draft. She took the extra underskirt from her bag and folded it along the bottom of the door where cold air breathed through the gap. She tested the washbasin, found a skin of ice across the water, and broke it carefully with the handle of her brush. The sound was small, but in the empty room it seemed almost rude. She crossed to the hearth and knelt, lifting the iron grate with both hands. Beneath the dead ash, she found 3 pieces of charcoal and the curled corner of an old packing slip, brittle but dry. The chair near the window had one cracked leg. Avery looked at it for a long moment, then whispered an apology to no one and worked the loose rung free. It came away with a dry snap. Not enough for a real fire. Enough for a beginning. Her fingers moved stiffly as she arranged the paper, charcoal, and splintered wood. She had watched kitchen girls coax flames from worse in winter storms back home, when North Hollow roads closed under 6 inches of snow and everyone pretended not to be worried until the bread ran low. The first match broke. The second caught, flared, and nearly died before Avery cupped both hands around it. Smoke lifted thin and bitter. Then the paper curled orange. The charcoal glowed. The small flame took the broken chair rung as if accepting a secret. Heat did not fill the room, not truly, but a narrow thread of warmth reached her face, and Avery closed her eyes for one breath. That was when the floor answered. Not with scratching this time. With a slow pulse beneath the boards, deep enough to travel through her knees and into the stone walls. The crescent mark at the center of the room brightened under the edge of the folded rug, faint silver showing through dust. Avery turned, still holding the spent match between her fingers. From somewhere below her, far beneath wood and stone and the careful cruelty of the people who had sent her here, something breathed in. Avery should have stepped back. Every reasonable part of her knew that a young woman alone in a locked tower room should not kneel beside a glowing mark in the floor and listen to something breathe beneath the boards. But reason had been polite to her for too long. It had taught her to accept smaller rooms, colder meals, softer insults, and promises that changed shape when other people entered the room. So she set the spent match on the hearthstone, took the candle in one hand, and pulled the rug away completely with the other. Dust rose in a pale cloud. Beneath it, the crescent mark was not alone. Lines curved outward from it in a pattern too careful to be damaged, forming the shape of a sleeping wolf wrapped inside the moon. The carving had been filled once with silver, though most of it had darkened with age. At the 4 corners of the design, iron nails had been driven deep into the wood, each one capped with a small black seal. Avery leaned closer, and the cold in the room gathered around her shoulders like a cloak. Her wolf stirred again, more awake now, not loud but certain. The feeling moved through her ribs with the quiet insistence of a hand placed over a door from the other side. Open it. Avery swallowed. The words had not sounded in the room. They had sounded in her blood. She looked toward the door, half expecting footsteps in the hall, a servant returning, Mercer calling her name with that smooth displeasure of his. Nothing came. The castle remained still, but not asleep. She could feel Ravencrest listening through its stones. Avery searched the room for something useful, and found the broken chair leg near the hearth, its end rough enough to wedge beneath one of the nail caps. The first seal resisted. Her fingers ached. Her breath clouded in front of her lips. She pressed harder, not with anger, but with the steady patience of someone who had mended hems by candlelight, and carried water when the pump froze and learned that stubborn things often gave way if you refused to ask their permission. The seal lifted with a soft click. The candle flame rose straight and bright. Somewhere below, the breathing stopped. Avery froze. Then a sound moved through the floor, low and deep, not threatening, not gentle, but aware. She pried up the second seal, then the third. With each one, the air changed. The room did not become warmer, exactly, but it became less empty. By the time the fourth seal loosened, the crescent mark shone with a thin silver light that made the cracked washbasin, the dead fireplace, and Avery's plain blue dress look as though moonlight had entered without using the window. The floorboard at the center of the carving shifted. Not much. Less than an inch. Enough to show a narrow seam and the darkness beneath it. Avery placed both hands on the wood and lifted. The panel was heavier than it looked, but it moved, slowly, unwillingly, as if waking hurt. A breath of air rose from below, carrying the scent of cold stone, dried lavender, old cedar, and something wild that made Avery's eyes sting without knowing why. Beneath the floor was not a pit, but a stairway, narrow and silver with frost along the edges. At the top step lay a small object wrapped in faded white cloth. Avery reached down and unfolded it carefully. Inside was a broken piece of a crown, no larger than her palm, shaped like a crescent and marked on the inner rim with a name written in letters so old they should have meant nothing to her. They did not mean nothing. Her hand closed around the silver fragment, and her quiet wolf rose fully inside her chest for the first time in years. Avery had imagined, in the small frightened corner of her mind that still belonged to ordinary things, that the stairway would end in a cellar full of mold, broken furniture, and forgotten barrels. Instead, each step carried her farther from the tower room and closer to a silence so complete it felt preserved. The stone walls on either side of her were smooth, older than the castle above them, and faintly marked with the same crescent and sleeping wolf she had found beneath the rug. Her candle should have struggled in the narrow passage, but the flame burned high and steady now, throwing gold over frost that clung to the edges of the stairs like lace. Avery kept the broken crown piece pressed against her palm. It was cold at first, then slowly, impossibly, warmer than her skin. Her wolf did not retreat. That alone made her breath come carefully. 4 years, Avery had lived with a hollow place inside her, a quiet absence everyone else had treated as proof. Proof she was weak. Proof she was unfinished. Proof she could be placed wherever was convenient. Now that hollow place was full of watchfulness, and it frightened her, because it felt less like something new entering her and more like something old finally standing up. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a round chamber carved directly into the foundation of Ravencrest. No torch burned there. No window touched it. Yet the room glowed with a pale silver light coming from lines in the floor, circles within circles, all drawn around the still shape at the center. Avery stopped so suddenly the candle wax spilled warm over her fingers. She barely felt it. A white wolf lay sleeping on a stone platform, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, its fur bright as winter moonlight, its body surrounded by old cords, silver salt, and dried lavender scattered in careful rings. It did not look dead. It looked waiting. The air around it held the clean scent of snow, cedar, and rain on black stone. Avery's knees wanted to bend, not from fear, but from a recognition deeper than thought. She took one step forward. The crown fragment in her hand brightened. The wolf opened its eyes. They were not gold or green, or any color Avery knew how to name. They were silver, but not metal silver. Moon silver. River silver. The color of light caught beneath ice. Above her, somewhere far up through layers of stone and wood, Ravencrest Castle answered. A low tremor moved through the walls. Dust slipped from the ceiling in soft gray threads. In the great hall below the tower, though Avery could not see it, wine glasses chimed against one another and every candle flame leaned toward the north. The white wolf did not rise. It only looked at her, and the quiet inside Avery became a voice without sound. Daughter of the hidden line. Avery pressed one hand to her chest. No, she whispered, though she did not know what she was refusing. The wolf's gaze moved to the crown piece in her palm. She looked down at it then, really looked, and saw that the old letters on the inner rim were not a name from some dead royal house. They were 2 words, clean and unmistakable now, as if the silver had been waiting for her eyes to understand them. Caldwell Luna. Avery closed her hand around the fragment again. For the first time since Ethan's library, since Vanessa's smile, since Elder Mercer's careful arrangements, something inside her did not shrink from the truth. It unfolded. Above, a distant door opened somewhere in the castle, followed by hurried footsteps moving toward the north tower. Avery did not run back up the stairs when she heard the footsteps. The old part of her wanted to, the trained part, the part that had learned to make itself smaller before doors opened and powerful people entered rooms already certain of what they would find. But the chamber below Ravencrest held her still. The white wolf watched from the stone platform, neither rising nor retreating, its silver eyes steady on her in a way that made panic feel almost impolite. Above, the footsteps paused in the tower room. Avery heard the faint scrape of the panel she had lifted, then a voice came down through the stairwell, low enough not to carry beyond the room. "Miss Caldwell." Logan Hawthorne did not sound surprised. That unsettled her more than if he had shouted. Avery closed her fingers around the crown fragment, until its crescent points pressed into her palm. "I am here," she said, and her voice returned from the stone wall softer but stronger than she expected. Logan descended slowly, one hand braced near the wall, not because he needed support, but because the passage was narrow and old and he seemed to understand that sudden movement would be an insult to whatever slept below the castle. The candlelight found him piece by piece, charcoal coat, dark clasp, pale eyes fixed first on the glowing marks in the stone and only then on Avery. When he saw the white wolf, his expression changed. Not fear. Not ownership. Recognition carrying the weight of a prayer someone had stopped expecting to be answered. "So it was true," he said. Avery stepped slightly in front of the stone platform, before she could think better of it. Logan noticed. Something almost gentle moved through his face, then disappeared. "I am not here to take anything from you." The words were simple. That was what made them difficult to trust. Men like Ethan offered comfort only when it cost them nothing. Men like Mercer offered protection with a lock already hidden inside it. Avery looked down at the crown piece in her hand. "Then why are you here?" Logan removed his dark mantle and held it out, not touching her, not draping it over her shoulders, as if she were a child, only offering warmth and waiting for her to decide whether to accept it. The chamber was cold enough that her breath showed white between them. After a moment, Avery took the mantle with her free hand and settled it around herself. It smelled faintly of pine smoke, leather, and the clean air before snow. "Because that key should have been destroyed 17 years ago," he said. "And because Grant Mercer looked relieved when you took it." The white wolf lowered its head once, as if agreeing. Avery turned back toward the platform, and saw what she had missed before. Behind the rings of salt and lavender stood a cedar chest half hidden beneath a fall of pale cloth. Its lid bore the same crescent wrapped around a sleeping wolf, but there was no lock. Only a shallow groove shaped exactly like the broken crown piece. Avery crossed the room. Logan did not follow until she glanced back, and even then he stayed 3 steps behind her. She fitted the fragment into the groove. The cedar lid loosened with a sigh. Inside were papers wrapped in oilcloth, a miniature portrait cracked through the corner, a folded blue ribbon, and a ledger so old its leather cover had softened at the edges. Avery lifted the portrait first. The woman painted there had Avery's mouth, Avery's dark blonde hair, and a calm sadness in her grey eyes that made the chamber seem suddenly too small. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words Marianne Caldwell, keeper of the Northern Lunar Line. Avery sat back on her heels. Her mother had died when Avery was 12, leaving behind a sewing box, 3 winter dresses, and a warning never to trust documents signed in another person's study. She had never spoken of Ravencrest. She had never spoken of a lunar line. Avery opened the ledger with fingers that no longer felt cold. Names filled the pages, some crossed out, some circled, some marked hidden for protection. Near the end, one entry had been cut from the paper, but not cleanly enough. The remaining edge showed 2 words. Avery Caldwell. Logan's voice was quiet behind her. Read everything first. Then decide what you want me to know. Avery looked at him then, really looked, and understood that he was giving her something no one in Ethan's library had allowed her to keep. Time. Choice. The white wolf breathed once, deep and slow, and the hidden chamber answered around them like a heart remembering how to beat. Avery read until the candle had burned low enough to leave a shallow pool of wax on the stone beside her knee. The ledger did not tell its truth loudly. It did not accuse. It recorded. That made it worse. Page after page held transfers, ward appointments, sealed protections, guardianship clauses, and old bloodline confirmations written in the careful language of people who knew how to hide cruelty inside procedure. Her mother's name appeared 3 times. Marianne Caldwell, provisional keeper. Marianne Caldwell, line protected under Northern Authority. Marianne Caldwell, presence to remain undisclosed until successor reaches full wolf maturity. Avery traced the words with one finger, and felt the years rearrange themselves quietly inside her. Her mother had not been secretive, because she was ashamed. She had been afraid. Near the back of the ledger, tucked between 2 brittle pages, Avery found a folded letter with Grant Mercer's seal pressed into grey wax. The seal had cracked with age, but the words inside remained clear. If the Caldwell girl fails to awaken by 23, the line may be declared dormant and the Ravencrest claim absorbed into council custody. Until then, the girl must remain unverified. No formal testing. No public challenge. No contact with the sealed guardian. Avery read the final line twice, before she understood why her hands had gone so still. Exposure to the North Tower chamber should suppress any unstable wolf response and support a finding of incapacity if needed. Logan was standing a few feet away, turned slightly from her as if privacy could still exist in a room full of buried records. He did not ask what she had found. That was why she handed him the letter. He read it once, and the air around him changed so subtly that Avery felt it before she saw it. Not rage. Not performance. Something colder and more controlled. This is enough to call a council hearing, he said. Avery looked past him at the white wolf resting inside its silver rings. They expected the room to make me weaker. Her voice did not break, which surprised her. They expected to be able to point at me tomorrow and say I was unstable. Logan folded the letter with care. Yes. Above them, faint voices drifted through the passage. Avery lifted her head. The panel in the tower room must still have been open, because sound traveled down in thin, uneven pieces. Vanessa spoke first, her voice sharpened by worry she had not learned how to hide. She should have called for someone by now. Mercer answered in the same smooth tone he had used at dinner. If the chamber works as it did before, she will be in no condition to challenge anything by morning. A pause. Then Ethan, quieter than the others. And if she is simply cold? Vanessa gave a small, humorless laugh. Then she will learn what happens to women who mistake pity for position. Avery closed her eyes, not because the words hurt most, but because they did not surprise her enough. That was the part that made grief feel old. Logan moved toward the stairs, but Avery reached out and touched his sleeve. Not to stop him forever. Only to stop him first. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. She released him slowly. Not yet, she said. The white wolf opened its eyes again, silver light spreading across the chamber floor. Avery stood with the ledger in one hand and Mercer's letter in the other, feeling the mantle warm around her shoulders and the crown fragment steady against her palm. For the first time in her life, the silence inside her was not empty. It was waiting. Tomorrow they can explain it in front of everyone, she said. By morning, Ravencrest Castle had learned to pretend nothing had happened. Servants moved through the corridors with trays of coffee, warm rolls, and folded linens, but their eyes traveled too quickly toward the North Tower, then away again. The council gathered in the Great Hall. Beneath the black iron chandeliers, where the previous night's laughter had left no trace except a few wine stains on the long table and one cracked goblet no one had removed. Avery entered last. She wore the same plain blue dress, brushed clean as well as she could manage, with Logan Hawthorne's dark mantle folded over one arm instead of around her shoulders. She did not want anyone to mistake borrowed warmth for borrowed courage. The ledger rested against her side. Mercer's letter lay inside it. The crown fragment was tucked safely in her pocket, cold and steady as a second pulse. Conversations thinned when she crossed the hall. Vanessa Cole looked first at Avery's face, then at her hands, searching for tremor, confusion, proof of the story she had prepared. Ethan Vale stood beside her with the pale, uncomfortable expression of a man who had expected regret to arrive privately, not sit across from him before breakfast. Elder Grant Mercer rose from his chair with careful dignity. "Miss Caldwell," he said, making her name sound like a correction. "We were concerned. The North Tower room is unsuitable for guests who are unaccustomed to old stone." Avery placed the ledger on the table. The sound was soft, but it traveled. "Then it is strange that you assigned it to me." Vanessa gave a small sigh, almost tender. "Avery, no one assigned it to hurt you. You were overwhelmed last night. Anyone would understand if the room frightened you." "It did frighten me," Avery said. The honesty seemed to please them for half a breath. Then she opened the ledger. "But not for the reason you hoped." The Great Hall became still in the particular way a forest becomes still when snow begins. Mercer's fingers tightened on the back of his chair. Avery laid out the first page, then the second, then the folded letter with his seal. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She read the lines as they were written, each phrase clean and plain enough that no one could hide behind tone. No formal testing. No public challenge. No contact with the sealed guardian. By the time she finished, the widow who had sat beside her at dinner had one hand pressed to her mouth. The visiting accountant stared at the table as if numbers had betrayed him. Ethan whispered, "Mercer, what is this?" Mercer did not answer him. His eyes had moved to Logan, who stood near the far end of the hall, silent until silence could no longer protect anyone. "North Hollow recognizes the validity of those records," Logan said. "And the right of Avery Caldwell to call testimony under old Ravencrest law." Vanessa's composure cracked first. "There is no testimony. There is only an unstable Omega, who spent one night in a forbidden room and found papers she cannot possibly understand." Beneath the floor, something answered. It was not loud. It was not violent. It was a deep silver sound that moved through the stones, through the table legs, through every cup and candle in the hall. The boards at the center of the room glowed with the crescent and sleeping wolf, the same mark Avery had touched in the tower. Chairs scraped back. No one commanded them to move. They simply did. The pale light rose, and within it stood the White Guardian, not as flesh exactly, not as mist either, but as presence made visible. Its silver eyes settled on Avery, then on the council. Every wolf in the room lowered their gaze. Avery felt her own wolf rise, calm and awake, no longer a candle struggling in a draught, but a flame protected by stone. She placed the crown fragment on the table. "My mother's name was Marianne Caldwell," she said. "Mine is Avery Caldwell. And I would like Elder Mercer to explain why both names were hidden from me." For a long moment after Avery spoke her mother's name, no one in the Great Hall seemed willing to be the first person to breathe. The White Guardian stood in the silver light behind her, quiet as snowfall, and the old stones of Ravencrest held that quiet with a reverence the council had forgotten how to offer. Elder Grant Mercer looked smaller without his certainty. He began with procedure, as Avery had known he would. He spoke of dormant lines, unstable claims, incomplete records, and protective custody. He used every polished phrase that had once made her feel too young, too poor, too ordinary to question men who kept ledgers behind locked doors. But this time, the words did not arrange the room around him. They fell flat against the table, one after another, while the broken crown piece glowed beside Avery's hand. Logan Hawthorne did not interrupt. He did not rescue her from the silence, or speak over her grief. He stood where the whole hall could see him, and let Avery remain the center of the truth that belonged to her. When Mercer finally stopped, Avery opened the ledger to the final page, and turned it toward the council. "My mother was not hidden, because she had no claim," she said. "She was hidden, because she had one you wanted." The widow from dinner rose first. Then the visiting accountant, pale and shaken, confirmed the seal marks in a voice that trembled but did not fail. One by one, the room shifted away from Mercer. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough for Avery to understand that power could leave a man quietly, the same way dignity could return to a woman who had been denied it. Vanessa Cole said nothing. Her silver necklace looked suddenly too bright at her throat. Ethan Vale tried to meet Avery's eyes, and for the first time since the orchard paths of their youth, she felt nothing in her chest move toward him. Not anger. Not longing. Only recognition, clean and final. He had mistaken her quiet for emptiness, and now he had to stand in a room where the oldest thing in Ravencrest recognized her name. By sunset, Mercer's keys had been taken from him, his records sealed for review, and the North Tower room opened under witness. No one called it unsuitable then. No one laughed about drafts or temporary needs. Servants carried up clean blankets, split logs, warm water, and a brass lamp that filled the chamber with honey-colored light. Avery watched them work from the doorway, still wearing her plain blue dress, the crown fragment wrapped in white cloth, and tucked safely into the cedar chest below. The room was still cold. Old things did not change all at once simply because the truth had been spoken. But the cold no longer felt like punishment. It felt like stone remembering winter and waiting for fire. Logan arrived after the others had gone, carrying a tray himself because, he said, the kitchen was overwhelmed and he did not trust formal apologies served cold. There was bread, butter, apple preserves, and a cup of coffee with cream. Avery almost smiled before she could stop herself. He set the tray on the small table and placed a rolled map beside it. "Ravencrest has several sealed rooms," he said. "You do not have to open any of them tonight." Avery looked toward the repaired hearth, where the first real fire in years burned low and steady. Beneath her feet, the hidden chamber rested in peaceful silence, and inside her, her wolf rested too, awake but unafraid. She took the map, not because Logan offered it, but because she wanted to see what had been kept from her. "Tomorrow," she said. Logan nodded, accepting the boundary as easily as he had offered the mantle. When he left, Avery sat near the fire with the map across her lap and her mother's ledger close enough to touch. The room they had chosen to erase her had become the first place in Ravencrest that knew her fully. They had given her a locked door, a frozen bed, and a floor meant to swallow her voice. Instead, Beneath that floor, her name had been waiting,